But his mother fell ill after giving birth and died a few days later. Siddhartha was brought up by his aunt. The family summoned Brahmin priests and then a trusted palace soothsayer to predict the young prince's future. We're told that he noticed the auspicious signs of a great being upon Siddhartha's body, including the mark of a wheel upon his feet.
It's said that the Buddha was born with certain marks on his body, so-called 32 marks of a great person. They're seen as appearing on the body of two kinds of people, one who will become a Buddha and one who will become a world emperor. His father was quite keen on the idea that his son would become a great political leader, so this is why it's said that he cosseted his son to prevent him seeing things which might send him in a religious direction.
Everyone knew the signs meant Siddhartha was exceptional, especially the king. But as he watched his inquisitive young son growing up, he worried about these predictions, that one day his son would abandon the palace and become a spiritual leader rather than stay to become chief of the Shakyas. As Siddhartha grew older, his father was delighted to see the boy's exceptional ability at the princely sports of fencing, wrestling, and archery. But he also noticed that Siddhartha was a deeply thoughtful and curious child. He appeared to be more interested in trying to understand the nature of the world around him than in military pursuits. For the king, these were the most important skills young Siddhartha should learn if he was to become a leader of men. Siddhartha was expected to become the future king and defender of Kapilavastu, one of the very first cities in northern India. The palace where Siddhartha grew up has long since crumbled away. Its mud and wood construction have left nothing for archaeologists to examine. But more durable materials have recently been discovered at Tillarakot.
We cut a trench 3 meters by 3 meters, and eventually we had a very clear sequence at the site. And then we began to be somewhat surprised by identifying a material known as painted greyware, which is basically a flat bowl with black paint.
This tiny fragment has huge significance. Dr. Conningham believes it was made in the 5th century BC, at the time Siddhartha was growing up in the palace.
What we have is a centre of small industry. We're probably dealing with settlements that we'd even hesitate to call a city today, centred around a large courtyard belonging to the ruler, and the majority of the population actually living in the agrarian hinterland.
It was this hinterland, lying beyond the city walls, that fascinated Siddhartha. So when at the age of 9 his father allowed him out to celebrate the annual ploughing festival, he eagerly participated. His first glimpse of reality beyond the palace walls would open a door for Siddhartha to a new vision of the world and would become the turning point of his life. The story recalls that he watched a farmer ploughing. He saw the toil and effort, struggle and repetition of this back-breaking work, something he'd never seen in the palace. He managed to slip away from the festivities and be alone. This first experience of real life had a profound effect upon him. To everyone else, this was a celebration, but to Siddhartha, it symbolized something quite different. He felt his mind leading him into a contemplative state. He watched the plough as it cut and parted the ground, and noticed a bird eating a freshly unearthed worm. He asked himself why living beings have to suffer in this way. If the farmer had not been ploughing, the bird would not have eaten the worm. He realized that everything was connected and that all actions had consequences. This simple observation would become one of the cornerstones of his teachings, known as karma. As Siddhartha's mind focused on these profound thoughts, he slipped into a trance or jhana, a mental state which would become his first step on the road to enlightenment.
He was sat under a tree and he just focusing on the plough going through the earth. And it's said that while doing that, he fairly naturally went into a meditative state called the first jhana, which was very, very joyful and happy, and which he later uses as part of his spiritual path. The connection to Buddhist meditation is the focusing on something, which has a calming, centering effect. Possibly also the idea of compassion for the worms being killed as the plough went through the earth. So I suppose one would see this as just part of his rather special nature, that he could just flip into the first jhana that easily. I wish it was that easy for the rest of us.
The young prince's behavior deeply unsettled the king. Brahmanism, the religious tradition of the time, insisted that sons should follow in the footsteps of their fathers.
One of the things that I think makes this narrative so powerful is, again, we can imagine this scene of his father trying to protect his son from encountering any suffering. Now, his reason for doing this is that there has been a prophecy that he'll either become a universal monarch or he'll become a renunciant who will gain enlightenment. His father, of course, wants him to become a king. He wants him to follow in his footsteps.
As Siddhartha grew up, his father did all he could to tempt him to stay inside the palace. He tried to create a perfect and seductive world for him to live in. As was customary for a prince, Siddhartha was offered beautiful maidens to entertain him with music and to pleasure him with their physical beauty. When Siddhartha reached the age of 16, the king even found him a beautiful bride, Princess Yasodhara. Siddhartha had to compete for her hand, and the king was delighted how skillfully his son fought off the competition. The king began to convince himself that palace life was beginning to suit his son at last. But this was wishful thinking, and Siddhartha pestered his father to allow him out of the palace. Unable to refuse his son's wishes any longer, the king desperately set about clearing every eyesore from the surrounds of the palace. Like a Hollywood film set, the sick, the poor, and the old were all deleted from the fantasy presented to the young prince.
Remind me very much of a time when I was in Durham and a member of the royal family was coming to Durham, and they did up the place. And they repainted the railings, but only as far as the member of the royal family could see, and not round the corner. So the world was tarted up, and the Buddha was in that sense protected from seeing the realities of life.
Despite his father's efforts, Siddhartha's first taste of the outside world would reveal